and welcome to In the Author's Corner. I'm Nadia Jordana, and my guest today is Jennifer Fernjack. She's the author of Greater Than, The Power and Strength of Emotional Grit. Let's go talk to Jennifer and learn more. Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Thank you, Nadia. It's great to be here.
I have some questions for you. One of the first things I wanted to know is what came first for you, speaking or writing?
The public speaking came first. My story stems from a 2016 medical scare with a surprising diagnosis that I received of a brain tumor. And through my experience, there were different things that helped me between the diagnosis, the anticipation of the danger of surgery, the healing process, the radiation treatments that I received. I should note that my particular kind of tumor was not cancerous, but the radiation treatments were needed to go ahead and kill the remaining part of the cells. And as part of my experience, I wanted to share what I learned with others. So I began public speaking about 4 years ago regarding this topic.
So the process for you was the medical scare, and then sharing that story with other people, and the book came along later. Had you been doing any kind of writing as far as creative writing, or is that was that a passion for you, or did that also become maybe a creative tool for you now later on?
You know, the writing of the book was actually somewhat done in tandem with the speaking, because it took me almost 3 years to write my book. So it was quite the process between traveling for work and then meeting strangers on planes, calling people, reaching out to them for their own stories of emotional grit. And so it took a while to put everything together, but definitely the writing came with the story of emotional grit. And I hadn't done it before at all. Everything's been new over the last 4 years of public speaking and writing.
So it's only been 4 years since the beginning of this journey has started. I'm wondering if you could share a couple of stories from the book.
Definitely. So one of the people who I interviewed is somebody who survived the 35W bridge collapse, which happened in 2007. And his story is nothing short of amazing. I know a lot of people assume that of course, going down with the bridge, I mean, his car literally collided with another one midair and went down into the river below. And it was over 100 feet that he fell down into the river. But a lot of people think about the physicality of getting into an accident like that. And he had broken bones. He had, I mean, you name it. He literally woke up 3 weeks later after the bridge collapsed in the hospital with his jaw wired shut. He had casts, he had stitches, I mean, you name it. I mean, there were a lot of things that were wrong. But you know, those were the physical injuries. But he also had the emotion and just the mental capacity to try to get through as well. And so through his story, he talks about how he took up skydiving, he took up riding motorcycles. The whole thought was that he wanted to face fear on his terms and win. You know, he felt as though when the bridge collapsed, the bridge never gave him that chance to do something by choice and kind of own it. Whereas by doing those things later, it was very empowering for him. So his story was one of the ones that I collected for the book. I also have the story of a physician who's from the Twin Cities who was mauled by bears. He and 3 of his friends were hiking out west. This was probably maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And he had walked ahead of the others when all of a sudden he came across 2 bears. And thankfully, his friends were able to save him. 2 of them literally ran for help while one was blowing a whistle, trying to get the attention of anybody who was in the woods to help. And thankfully, there was somebody who heard the whistle and then was able to go get some help for them. But then the one person who stayed behind with the physician who had been attacked is a Minneapolis firefighter. And when the helicopter came to save the physician, there was only room for him. There wasn't room for both of them. So the firefighter had to stay behind in bear territory where the food source was still there. And he had left the area, but was still close enough to where it was scary. But their story of cheating death and coming together as a group. And I know when I wrote it up in the book, I called out the fact that they literally went on the trip as friends, but then came home as brothers through their experience. So their story of grit goes a long way as well.
I was wondering, as you were telling that story, when you first started writing the book and you wrote your part of the story and decided to add additional stories and adventure, well, not adventures, journeys from other people, how did you find the people? How did you discover them?
Well, thankfully, I had colleagues who, I know one in particular, his neighbor was the person who fell off, or I shouldn't say fell off, the person who went down with the 35W bridge collapse. So he referred me to his neighbor. I know I also, through a colleague of mine, was able to actually interview someone who played in the 1980 Miracle on Ice hockey game against the Soviets during the Cold War. And so through this connection, through a colleague of mine, I reached Rob McClanahan, who played in the game. And he shared with me just what it was like from a psychological and a mental and a physical aspect of playing the Soviets during that time. So yeah, a lot of it was warm leads in that regard. Other times it was a matter of when I was traveling for work, I would just meet people on planes, or I would meet people who I was interviewing for work. They might have a client who I perhaps could interview. I know one in particular was someone who I met who knew someone who actually served as a firefighter at Ground Zero on 9/11. And so I interviewed him for the book. And again, just the emotional grit that it took. I mean, literally, he and the other firefighters that were part of his company had to drop their gear and run. And the remaining gear they were wearing was over 100 pounds. They had to run when the second tower collapsed because the debris was coming at them. So his story is nothing short of amazing as well. So thankfully, a lot of people were referring people to me to interview for the book. And then just by chance, I would also meet people when I was traveling.
Oh, absolutely. And I think once you started the book, I'm assuming that people who knew you were writing the book would come to you with stories.
Definitely. And part of it too was luck, or I felt blessed too as far as things that happened. I know one time in particular, I was on an airplane and the gentleman next to me had mentioned to me that he served in Vietnam. And as I was hearing his story about what it was like to be over there and the fact that he served in combat, we had talked about the fact that hope can literally affect people physically. And I had shared with him how hope had affected me physically, as far as lowering stress hormones and increasing the activity of the feel-good chemicals of the brain through my brain tumor scare. And he had said, I noticed the same thing in Vietnam. So when I asked him for more of his story, he had mentioned that he literally had met medics. And there were a number of medics who shared the same story with him again and again, where when they were on the battlefield, they could literally tell a material difference in the vital signs of the soldiers that they were holding, who literally were dying in their arms. Once those soldiers could hear the sounds of the helicopters that were coming to save them. Hope can affect you physically. And that was also part of why I wanted to write the book, to gather these stories and let people know that there's science behind how we're wired and how certain things in life can literally reduce those stress hormones and increase the feel-good chemicals of the brain. So
I've never heard that put into words before, but that makes sense.
I also noticed that between my diagnosis of the brain tumor and then of course the surgery and the different radiation treatments, that there were other things in everyday life, which are now of course written about in my book, that can affect us physically. So for example, when somebody says something like, oh, it felt so good to laugh, that's because laughter can literally lower the cortisol levels. You know, it's that stress hormone and then increase the feel-good chemicals of the brain. So I suggest to people that if you get stressed out at work, or if you're having family problems, any kind of relationship issues, or perhaps a medical scare like mine, go on your smartphone, pull up Pandora. And on Pandora, you can literally listen to whatever comedian you want and sit there and laugh as you're getting ready for work, or maybe you're enjoying your commute. So, laughter is one of those things, just like hope. It's also worth noting that that music can affect people physically. So there's a reason why if you go to a stadium event, like say a Vikings game or a Twins game or something, all it takes is a little bit of We Will Rock You by Queen to get thousands of people on their feet, clapping their hands. Well, it's upbeat music can affect those feel-good chemicals of the brain.
Certain melodies can do that. And of course, we know how marches get a crowd going and into the mood. So that all makes sense.
Definitely.
I was also wondering, yeah, when we think about emotional grit and you going through a trauma like that with an illness, what about the peripheral people, your family, husband if you were married, parents, children? How would you describe the emotions that they went through, and how does it apply?
Good question. I know a lot of people tend to focus on the underlying patient, like I was, but the caregivers are also important. And people will sometimes assume that caregiving just means a parent taking care of a child, but it could also mean one spouse taking care of another, or maybe an adult taking care of their parent and their child. It's part of what's called the sandwich generation. And so with my public speaking, I have two different messages that I share with people. One is on the power and strength of emotional grit, which are the things I was talking about earlier in terms of music and things like that. The other one is specifically for caregivers. So in that message and in my book as well, I'll talk about things such as compassion fatigue. You know, compassion fatigue is something where maybe the person is just feeling exhausted from taking care of somebody. And sometimes it could just be mental exhaustion. Maybe that to-do list is just way too long. So, and then people will feel guilty because they might think, well, I should want to take care of my spouse, or I shouldn't feel so irritated with my parents or my kids. But it's called compassion fatigue, and there are certain symptoms with that should be addressed. There's also something called emotional labor. And with emotional labor, that's something where on the outside, someone's smiling. And so the assumption is, hey, everything's fine. When really on the inside, not so fine. You know, you're drowning. So that dichotomy is worth noting as well. And I think that there's a lot to be said for caregivers.
I think putting some of these things into words is really helpful for your audience. I was also wondering if you could describe your target audience and what are some of the things you hope the book will do for them or help them through.
So as I've been doing my public speaking, I've learned to tailor it for whoever the audience is. So for example, if I give my speech about the power and strength of emotional grit at a nursing home, I might use different terminology than if I'm speaking at a high school. I know one thing that comes to mind is that when I speak about music, if I'm speaking to people at a high school, I might say, hey, when you put in your earbuds, you know, listen to music. But at a nursing home, I'll call them headphones. You know, so I try to tailor the vernacular that I use based on who the audience is. I also think that it's important to know that again, even though my story is medically centric in terms of emotional grit, it applies to anybody who's going through a time of stress. So literally the audience could be anybody.
Absolutely. And is there anything that I haven't asked you that you want to be sure that the audience knows about this book?
You know, I would say that one of the core themes of my book, as is alluded to in the title, where it's greater than the power and strength of emotional grit. And the reason why I say greater than is because people oftentimes assume that being brave must mean an absence of fear, when in reality, it could mean feeling afraid, but you're going to persevere anyway. So one of the things I ask people in the book is, what is your greater than? And if you think back to math class in high school or junior high, remember the greater than and less than signs? So I'll say to people, you use your right hand, your thumb and your pointer finger to make the greater than sign. And the example that I'll give people is within just a few months of my brain tumor surgery and the radiation treatments, I was invited to get on stage at my church. And I could have the pulpit for 7 or 8 minutes and share my story and how I got through everything. And people knew that before this opportunity, I had maybe spoken in front of probably, I don't know, maybe 60 people before. Whereas at the church, the sanctuary sat almost 1,000 people. And it was 4 different services. Some people would view it online. Some people viewed it just, you know, overseas. I mean, they would track how many people came to their website and what have you. And so people would say to me, well, Jennifer, if you think you're going to get nervous in front of a group that big, how are you going to do this? And my response was always, my desire to help others is greater than my fear of the stage.
I really, really like that. Well, do you have one last thing? Do you have some advice for, say, another professional similar to you who wants to put together a book when for their important message that they have? Do you have some tips for them?
I would say one of the things that's helped me the most over the last nearly 3 years is having people who either held me accountable or people who I could bounce questions off of. So I know that one group that's helped me a lot is called WOW. It's Women of Words. And once a month, I would have either a virtual call or an in-person meeting with them. And one of the great things about working with people who have done their own public speaking or book writing is that they won't just give best practices in terms of what to do. They'll also give you, with the gift of hindsight, things not to do. It might be, hey, I tried this, but don't do that. Learn from my mistake. And it's that transparency that if you can get involved with a group like that, even if you just Google, writers groups, Minneapolis, that kind of thing, or the Twin Cities. It's interesting how when you can work with people who understand things and can provide best practices, that can help carry you and keep you grounded at the same time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Jennifer, this has been fantastic. I'm so happy you could come on the show today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time and the opportunity.
I know.